In this week's episode of Bleach, the 1,000-Year Blood War battles begin as the Shinigami and Quincy are separated across the cityscape. Ichigo and his friends prepare to follow Uryu into the royal palace, and Mayuri Kurotsuchi takes on Sternritter Z Giselle in a war of the zombies. After taking a week off, the 1,000-Year Blood War anime has returned with what feels like something of a contentious episode this time. But to give my top-level thoughts right off the bat, I actually quite enjoyed it, and it felt like this episode, and specifically the focal battle of the week, was treated with a bit more care than I had initially anticipated. This week's episode does tackle some of the slightly darker material of the arc, featuring a face-off between two of the series' most depraved monsters and the slaves under their command. Not only that, but the overarching plot of the story itself forges on ahead as well, while the episode features both a few substantial cuts and structural changes that I find to be quite interesting, and we'll discuss them in greater detail in the analysis. Meanwhile, I thought the character art this week saw a noticeable improvement in quality over the last episode, and I'm hoping that the series can maintain or even exceed that level now through to the very end of the core, as we're only 4 episodes away from the finish line, which is absolutely crazy. I think the predictions segment of this episode will be a fun one. It seems to me that the anime is setting itself up for one hell of a final act this core, and I remain cautiously optimistic that some areas of the story, specifically the invasion of and battle for the royal palace, will receive much needed improvements. In a way, this episode, through no fault of its own, does feel a bit like a stepping stone to much bigger and more exciting events to come. While I did enjoy the episode a lot personally, I honestly just can't wait for what's ahead. But hey, that's a me problem. Anyway, as we begin our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the 1,000-Year Blood War, episode 22, Marching Out the Zombies, as always, I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read the entirety of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, meaning that there will be potential spoilers for the whole arc to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and what it took away from the source material. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, when you're done with it, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, I want to say a massive thank you and give an enormous shout out to everyone supporting me there over on Patreon, because I really do appreciate each and every one of you. It really does mean the absolute world to me. So thank you so very much. Now, as we break down what this episode actually covered, well, once again, the anime has chosen to prove me wrong in my predictions almost immediately. Last time I theorized that every episode from now until the end of the core might be totally jam-packed with chapter coverage. Yet, I'm astonished to say that this episode doesn't span that many chapters this week at all. In fact, we're almost back to that patented sweet spot of 4 chapters per episode, which feels amazing. And as far as I was concerned anyway, it had a noticeable effect on the pacing of the episode this time. There are a few hefty cuts this week. Nothing too integral, mind you, mostly comedic scenes, and a light dusting of new content too, although definitely not as substantial as last time. So these were the chapters covered in episode 22. Chapter 587, The Headless Star 6. The second half of Chapter 588, The Headless Star 7. Chapter 589, The Shooting Star Project, The Old and New Trust. Chapter 590, Marching Out the Zombies, the episode's title. And finally, Chapter 591, Marching Out the Zombies 2. We did also get the first 2 pages or so of Chapter 592, Marching Out the Zombies 3, but that barely even registers as being included. 5 chapters in an episode is a net improvement over the massive 7 or 8 chapters we'd been seeing lately, though it's possible that was a necessary sacrifice, a necessary evil to help aid what's yet to come. As I said earlier, predictions for the upcoming episodes will be interesting indeed. It's possible that, thanks to episodes 20 and 21 being so full, the end of the core might have a little more room to breathe, but we will get to that later on. Regarding episode 22, thanks to the pacing of the episode, for the first time in about a month, a relatively major battle gets the chance to be split across multiple weeks, allowing for a truly dramatic cliffhanger in the midst of the fight in order to build suspense, which, as we see this week, works really well. So, without further delay, on to the analysis itself. So, before we begin diving into episode 22, we have to first do something we don't normally do with these reviews. And that's look back at the previous episode, episode 21, because it turns out that a substantial portion of the source material was in fact cut completely from the anime. In my last review, I merely thought it was maybe being bumped to this week's episode instead due to time restraints, but it turns out that wasn't to be. The final chapter to be covered last week was chapter 586, specifically the second half of the chapter. The first half, featuring a showdown between the forces of Shinigami and Quincy, who had gathered to both protect and pursue Ichigo, was cut entirely. But as it was a fairly hefty section of action, I thought there might be a chance that it would be moved to this week's episode instead, perhaps opening the episode before the credits sequence took place. However, that doesn't happen. Instead, it's just gone completely. This is a real shame in my opinion, as this kind of battle royale between multiple characters at once doesn't happen a lot in Bleach. As Ichigo heads to Yhwach's tower, Rukia, Renji, Byakuya, Hisagi, Yumichika, and Ikkaku all arrive to defend him, blocking the Sternritter's path. Basby asks Robert if any of them are special war powers, and Robert denies it. Deciding instead then to just kill them and be done with it, Basby summons his Quincy crossbow, but Ikkaku jumps him from behind, slamming Hozokimaru into the ground. As Basby prepares to fire at Ikkaku, his arm is suddenly frozen. Rukia arrives, telling the Quincy they're not going anywhere. As Ikkaku taunts the Sternritter, Lil Toto approaches Basby, telling him she isn't going to be held up here and they should all just blow them away with their Quincy Volstendish. Agreeing, Basby activates his holy form along with the rest of the Sternritter, and together they rush into combat, the Gote 13 preparing themselves for an almighty battle ahead. All of this was sadly removed from last week's episode and doesn't show up this week either. Instead, we skip right ahead to everyone being separated into their own fights. Like I said, the real shame here is that we very rarely see major groups coming to blows like this all at once, and it slightly lessens the impact of seeing everyone arrive to protect Ichigo if you don't actually get to see any of that conflict play out. What's even slightly more annoying as we move into episode 22 is that once again this episode begins by simply reusing a scene from the previous week, this time featuring Uryu disappearing as Ichigo screams at him for some answers. At the same time, it actually makes a little more sense to do this time. Chapter 587 opens the exact same way by replaying the showdown from the end of the previous chapter, though at least in the source material the angles are slightly different. As Uryu and the others blast towards the heavens, however, the episode truly begins. As the enormous arrow of light explodes into the sky, we get some really fantastic visuals that in my opinion set the tone of expectation for the rest of the episode to come. The arrow doesn't just fire into the sky, it shatters the crimson veil around the Shakon Maku momentarily, ripping it apart and sending a colossal shockwave barreling across the battlefield. The effects of the shockwave and its incredible power are definitely portrayed better in the anime. Ichigo and his friends are sent flying across the landscape as rubble is tossed around like nothing, caught up in the frenzied tempest. A few additional scenes are included to show the effect of the shockwave. Lil Toto and Meninas, now only using the basic versions of their Volstendish, notice the blast and leap out of the way. It turns out they were facing Hisagi, who also flees the explosion. An entire tower is decimated, sending a massive chunk of stone towards Rukia. However, Renji leaps in front of her and shields them both with his Shikai. But I assume he uses bankai quickly to defend himself here, since we later see him holding back the stone wall with Soo Zabimaru. Far away from the site of that battle, Kyoraku, Nanao, and Okikiba, remember him, watch as debris is launched towards them. Nanao defends them with a Kido barrier. The effortless way she summons the barrier is very cool, but what's even better is Kyoraku's new dialogue, once again alluding to the fact that the Zero Division is up to no good. Kyoraku wonders why Yhwach isn't being shot out of the sky. The mere fact that he expects the Zero Division to be able to do that is very interesting as well, before wondering if simply letting them walk into the royal palace is all part of Ichibe's mysterious grand plan. As I speculated in earlier reviews, the anime is making Ichibe in particular appear very shady, as though he's content with allowing Yhwach to invade the palace because he thinks it'll give him the opportunity to kill him once and for all, and maybe even go so far as to use him as the new Soul King vessel. That's of course all speculation on my part still, but it does seem like that's what the anime is trying to imply with these new additions. As the fury of the shockwave dies down, we see a decimated wasteland of a battlefield. Orihime's shield glows orange in the midst of the ruin as rain begins to fall on them. What's interesting though is that this doesn't appear to be actual rain. It looks more like pieces of the Crimson Veil raining down upon the battlefield. We can see later on as well that blood-red liquid has pooled in spaces all over the ground, seemingly confirming this. Plus, when the veil briefly opens up, we can see the sky outside is brilliantly sunny. Though it is a little strange that the water on the characters' faces looks like normal rain to me. Regardless, I love this detail, and I appreciate that they are using the red veil of the Second Quincy invasion in some unique and interesting ways. As I mentioned in my last review, it doesn't seem to make sense for it to be able to rain beneath the Quincy's veil, which is perhaps why they removed it from Zaraki's scene last week as well. The idea of it raining blood all over the battlefield is quite poignant and a nice metaphor for the amount of lives that have been lost as a result of this fight, as a result of Yhwach simply wanting to reach the palace. As he achieves that goal, in that moment, what has been sacrificed as a result can now truly be felt across the war zone. Interestingly, Orihime gets a slightly different line here. In the original chapter, she comments that Uryu blasted them away before wondering if it was the Quincy boss instead. Here in the anime, she says that it was some ride they just went on after going flying, before hoping neither Ichigo or Chad bumped their heads. As she looks up though, she's saddened to see Ichigo deep in thought, pondering Uryu's betrayal. This next scene is changed greatly from the source material, completely transforming its overall feel in the episode. In the original chapter, Chad suddenly picks up Ichigo and launches him into a nearby building, shocking everyone, before Chad tries to reason with Ichigo and bring him back to reality by telling him that everyone is just as surprised as he is about Uryu, but Uryu must have his reasons. In the anime, the three of them simply stand together and discuss the situation in a way that I think is much more befitting of the gravity of what they've just experienced. While I do think it's amusing that Chad throws Ichigo, it also felt unnecessarily wild back in the day, and not really in keeping with how dour everyone was feeling. Here, in the anime, you get the sense that all of them are feeling the weight of what they've just witnessed, but like the adults they are now, they're discussing their next moves with maturity, and I really like that. It's a funny moment in the source material, sure, but in my opinion it also doesn't really track with the Chad we've seen since the time skip. A much more mature individual who's done a lot of growing up. I think the episode's version portrays Ichigo in a better light too. The original chapter implies this kind of forceful talking to is the only way he'll understand a serious situation, whereas in the episode he's treated more like a man and not a child they're afraid of throwing a temper tantrum. Ichigo even has new lines here where he gives a short speech about knowing all along in his heart that ever since this war began, it's been on his mind. If the battle is between Shinigami and Quincy, then that will most likely make him and Uryu enemies. It's a great moment as it makes total sense that this wouldn't catch him completely off guard, or at the very least it's nice to know that Ichigo isn't so closed off as to have not considered this a possibility. But I also love that despite everything, Ichigo and the others are resolute in believing in Uryu as they've fought side by side for so long. Here in the anime, once the initial shock has worn off, they don't seem to believe Uryu is actually evil for a second, which I like. It reflects how I think most of us felt when we were reading the series. I like the choice of flashbacks used here too. Showing Uryu coming to Ichigo's side in the Lost Agent arc is particularly nice, as Uryu was a much needed friendly face during that time for Ichigo. However, despite all of their platitudes, Ichigo ultimately isn't sure how Uryu feels. We return to the source material's conversation as Ichigo says they still need an explanation from him regardless, and they're going to go after him to find out why. We get a great shot of Ichigo that caps off this moment really well, where that familiar punkish side of him resurfaces briefly as he says even if Uryu's reasons aren't good enough, they'll smack him and drag him back no matter what. That brief shot is really all the levity this sequence needs. It's a nice callback to a much younger, more brash Ichigo who thinks more impulsively and is a bit hot-headed, but that's also his last resort tactic here. Plus, the art is great. It was really here where I knew I was going to be satisfied with how the episode looked this week. As the three of them suddenly realise that they don't know how to reach Uryu, Kisuke arrives, asking if they'd like a ticket to the royal palace. His line from the original chapter about it maybe taking some time is cut here. Once the opening titles are finished, we're treated to another new scene, one I'm admittedly very happy to see. Byakuya reveals himself, having defended himself from enormous chunks of stone using Senbon Zakura. As he gazes over at Yhwach's tower, he realises the Quincy's were never targeting Seirete to begin with, before questioning what Yhwach is up to with the royal palace. Like I said in my live reaction, it seems pretty obvious to me that the only reason you would invade the royal palace is to take down the king, but alas. These little moments of connective tissue within the narrative are so very important. They might not seem it, but it's fantastic having all of these disparate characters on the same page when you have a conflict this big, with such an enormous cast. It just makes everything flow that little better. However, as Byakuya looks on, he's suddenly confronted by several Sternritter. Nananajacoup appears, asking if Byakuya is going to pursue Yhwach even though they're not dead yet. Candice Catnip flies down, still sporting her injury from Basby's burner finger, which is a great little detail, and demands to know from Byakuya where Ichigo has gone. And then, finally, given a surprising amount of prominence here, Robert Akutrone arrives on the scene as well. There's an awesome moment where Robert walks slowly towards Byakuya, but his focus is elsewhere. He's staring over at Yhwach's tower and the crease in the sky where the Quincy King ascended. Robert is clearly wondering what's going to happen next. Presumably, there's still a chance for him to be chosen, and unlike some of the younger Sternritter, he's well aware that time has very nearly run out for them. This is a lovely little prelude to his ultimate fate and his eventual hysterical breakdown. It must be terrifying for the older Sternritter knowing that Yhwach leaving signals the end of your usefulness. If you're not brought to heaven with him later on, then it's over for you. As Robert silently approaches Byakuya, I have a few things to say about all of this. Firstly, I love how the battlefield looks now. Seeing the ground cracked and decimated beneath their feet while glittering puddles of blood-red liquid pool among the fractures is an awesome visual for the blood-soaked war, and it looks really great. It adds some much-needed texture to the surroundings, in my opinion. Secondly, and I know I'm asking for a lot, but this is what I want to see most from next week. An extended version of this battle. It is weird watching this new scene and knowing that these three just get totally annihilated off screen in the original chapter, so I'm hoping that they might put up a bit of a fight here instead. I like Byakuya a lot, don't get me wrong, but I want him to struggle a little. And hey, maybe we can get Robert Shrift, though at this point I'm not holding my breath. Regardless, at least they actually set this fight up in the anime, which I do appreciate. Up next is another brand new scene, and one I really wasn't expecting. Iba lifts a chunk of stone off himself like it's nothing apparently, as he and Komamura continue to make their way towards Yhwach's tower. Obviously, it's amazing to see Komamura again after he became a wolf. In the source material, the only time we ever saw him again was in a tiny panel in chapter 612, where it was revealed that he and Iba have requested to go it alone while we see they're surrounded by Soldat. And then Komamura was never seen again. Once again, I know I'm being optimistic, but why include this scene unless the anime team have some additional plans for the character? Iba specifically says they're not going to let Yhwach get away. It is kind of funny that they seem to be moving very slowly through the battlefield, but maybe that's due to Komamura adapting to his new body. Either way, I do wonder what the plan is here. It's possible Komamura and Iba will arrive at the Shinigami stronghold mere moments after everyone else has already ascended to the palace, thereby denying them their chance for revenge. Or we'll see them surrounded by Soldat later, and that's where we'll leave them. Either way, I'm so glad the anime team hasn't completely forgotten Komamura, and it gives me hope his character might receive some closure by the time the anime ends. Meanwhile, returning to the source material, Renji and Rukia ponder Uryu's seeming betrayal before being confronted by Bazz-B, still sporting his terrible Volsten dish, as he reveals the Sternritter hate Uryu too, and he'll happily give the Shinigami a hand in killing him. This line from Bazz-B was one of only a few references to the dissent surrounding Uryu's ascension to air that we ever received after chapter 543, and we wouldn't receive many more later either. Renji sends debris flying towards Bazz-B, however, insulting his mohawk at the same time. Many comedic scenes have been cut from this arc, but I'm glad that this was left in. Bazz-B flies into an uncontrollable rage at having his hairstyle mocked by Renji before revealing that he thought Renji might have actually had some taste, as his eyebrows look pretty cool. As Renji is immediately enamoured with Bazz-B upon hearing this, Bazz-B says it's too late and launches into an attack, activating Burner Finger 4 and summoning a massive, swirling sword of flame upon his outstretched hand. It's a great character moment for the two of them and a surprisingly humanising interaction for a Sternritter. However, Bazz-B's line to them both, where he says it's annoying to see a friend become an enemy, isn't it, is cut from the episode, which is a slight shame, as retrospectively that feels like a nice bit of foreshadowing to the events of the Friend saga between him and Hashwolf to come. Also, the progression of Burner Finger has been broken in the anime. In the source material, Burner Fingers 1 through 4 are used in succession, but here, Burner Finger 3 has been skipped completely. As we reach the end of chapter 587, which is clearly one of the beefier chapters in the episode, this is going to be quite a front-loaded review, I think. The cliffhanger is cut from the episode, featuring Yhwach stamping onto the holy grounds of the royal palace. That's not all, though. The entire first half of chapter 588 is missing as well, wherein Yhwach advances on the palace with his Soldat, only to be intercepted on the walkway by Tenjiro, who begins battling the Quincy's. Unlike the Shinigami and Quincy skirmish from last time, this time I'm certain, fingers crossed, that this content isn't gone for good. I imagine it's all being moved to episode 24, if I had to guess, but we'll talk about that further in the predictions section of this episode. But needless to say, I once again think this structural change is for the better. Firstly, it just makes sense that it would take Yhwach at least a bit of time to reach the palace rather than arriving almost immediately. It also allows us to build to that confrontation, which we know is coming at the end of the core, and then allow, hopefully, that entire invasion to play out uninterrupted, which would be incredible. By allowing the last two fights of the invasion of the Seirete to play out first, Mayuri versus Giselle and Byakuya versus Pepe, we can then allocate all focus to the invasion once we're done down here. So instead, we find ourselves at the midpoint of chapter 588 as Ikkaku and Yumichika confront Giselle. Although we still have some additional scenes to attend to outside of the main fight this week, the actual battle between Giselle and the Shinigami is portrayed quite faithfully for the most part. Giselle tries to get Ikkaku to cut her with her usual act, but Yumichika correctly guesses her scheme. I like the new little detail of Giselle's briefly changing expression when she realises Yumichika has her figured out. Speaking of her expression, the anime captures Giselle's overall personality really quite well. From the surface level, ditzy, almost pseudo-innocent nature that she presents to everyone, to of course the true sadism lying beneath, I think Giselle has been brought to life nicely here in the anime. Yumichika exposes Giselle for actually being a man, and Giselle's reaction action is again handled perfectly. On my first watch, I initially thought Yumichika's line about recognising Giselle as a man from her smell had been cut, but in actuality it's apparently present in the original Japanese broadcast and has instead been cut in the Disney Plus version of the episode that I watched. This is honestly pretty annoying. It's one thing for scenes to be removed from the anime at a creative level, but while I don't have any real love for the line itself, in fact I probably preferred it being gone from the perspective of the characters involved, for Disney Plus to apply their own level of additional censorship for audiences does annoy me. I'd rather receive the original unadulterated work and be allowed to decide how I feel for myself. Anyway, Giselle's face changes into a grim smile as Yumichika seemingly outs her, which is interesting. I liked the initial expression a lot, one of total shock and quiet horror, rendering Giselle totally speechless for a moment. But I'm not sure what this one serves outside of simply making her look creepy, though I do like it and again it's very well drawn. However, Giselle summons Bambietta with a shriek, the leader of the Bambis leaping into action as chapter 588 ends. Giselle clinging onto her supposed friend's back and commanding her to kill the Shinigami. As we begin chapter 589, we leave that fight again for a moment and return to the 12th Division's lab, where Ichigo and the others find themselves beside a replica of Ikkaku's cannon, ready to head for the royal palace. I presume this cannon must have rose up through the platform at some point because it certainly wasn't here earlier. There's some slightly new dialogue. Ichigo wonders where everyone else is, but Kisuke tells him the captains and vice-captains are all still battling the Quincy's to ensure their safe passage. Kisuke explains when and how the replica cannon came to be, with Ichigo surprised to hear Mayuri predicted Yhwach and the others would then head to the royal palace. I feel like Mayuri should have maybe let the other captains in on this premonition, since we've seen characters like Byakuya apparently completely caught off guard to learn what Yhwach's true target was. I like that they kept Ichigo's realization that Mayuri is actually very intelligent and not just a crazy man, with Kisuke even admitting that he's a genius but still second to him. I wonder if Kisuke was considering Aizen at all when he said that, since Aizen believed he was second only to Kisuke in intelligence previously. As Kisuke explains that they only get one chance with this cannon before it breaks, he mentions they don't currently have enough energy to power it. At this point, Akon arrives, letting Kisuke know that someone has returned from her assignment. This is clearly Yoruichi he's talking about, as Kisuke mentions it won't be long until they have their means of firing the cannon, before Akon lets him know that someone has returned from the field. Yoruichi then arrives, bringing what they need to fire the cannon. What's weird about this is the way it's presented in the anime, and a sizable amount of content has been cut from the source material here, so let's take a look at it holistically. In the source material, before Yoruichi arrives in the lab, Ichigo, Chad and Orihime have a chat inside the cannon. Chad says he wasn't sure when to bring this up, but he asks Ichigo what he thinks of Orihime's clothes. Of course, as of last week, Orihime is now wearing her 1000-Year Blood War specific outfit, which is incredibly revealing. Ichigo is absolutely aghast at this being brought up, and I'll be honest, his face here is hilarious. After he doesn't say anything for a few seconds, Orihime becomes very flustered and embarrassed before the two of them stammer uncontrollably at Chad as they fumble for words to say. Ichigo, blushing madly, thinks Orihime is revealing too much, or so he says on the surface anyway, horrifying Orihime, who worries Ichigo thinks that she's some kind of a freak or an exhibitionist. Orihime, attempting to cover her cleavage, says she isn't wearing the outfit for any kind of a sleazy reason, and is only wearing it because Urahara told her that Ichigo would love it. Urahara then warns Orihime that covering the front of the dress will only cause it to open at the sides instead. There is more cut content to follow, but for now we'll begin with this. On the surface, I am a little sad to see this scene gone. Firstly, it is quite funny. Ichigo's reaction to being asked in the first place is what makes me laugh the most. But perhaps more importantly, this is really the only time that both Ichigo and Orihime are even remotely confronted in the same room at the same time with the fact that they maybe have some kind of feelings for each other. We of course know that Orihime has deep feelings for Ichigo. This has been reiterated since practically the start of the series and then again in every arc since, but Ichigo has remained seemingly blissfully ignorant. So for him to have to face the fact that Orihime likes him with no escape, and he clearly feels something for her based on his reaction is very novel and unusual for the series. Bleach isn't a romance series, and romance plays a very small part in the story, but it's no coincidence that Kubo has Ichigo and Orihime spend most of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc together, and the same goes for Rukia and Renji. I do wonder what the intended outcome was here from Chad's perspective, and Orihime does seem to be in on it as well based on how she waits expectantly for Ichigo's response. I remember being amazed when this scene popped up originally because it was so strangely meta. I remember people thinking Orihime's outfit was absurd initially, but then for Kubo to draw attention to there being a meta reason behind it was quite funny and unexpected. And also I think it did Orihime a bit of a service as well to learn that she wasn't wearing this of her own volition. A part of me thinks this scene was removed to remain in keeping with the slightly more mature approach the episode is taking with these characters, as this scene, while funny, is a pretty blunt and immature approach to this kind of development. But there's really nothing in this scene that needed to be censored. For example, Orihime looks the exact same here as she does in every other scene in which she's wearing these clothes. I would have liked to have seen this moment play out, or some variant of it anyway, as I do think it helps to build Ichigo and Orihime's relationship a little bit. After all, he always seems to say the wrong thing to her, even though he obviously doesn't mean to hurt her, like when he comments on her weight in the Waco Mundo arc. It's possible this scene might return next week as the gang prepares to leave for the Royal Palace, but I guess we'll see. Anyway, moving on, there's more cut content too, and this time I think it is a little more warranted, personally anyway. As Orihime shrieks in embarrassment, suddenly Yoruichi appears telling her not to cry about it. The manner of Yoruichi's introduction has always been, frankly, weird and nonsensical, to the point where I don't even get what's meant to be going on. Yoruichi appears by shoving her hand between Orihime's breasts for some reason. Is it to get her to look up again after she was hunched over trying to hide her face, maybe? I have no idea, but then Yoruichi smacks Ichigo across the cheek and berates him, snapping at him that Orihime clearly doesn't want to wear the outfit and was tricked into doing so, and the least he could have done was made her feel better about wearing it. Honestly, everything else in this sequence is absolutely fine, it's just Yoruichi's actual introductory panel that is really weird and kind of out of place. And it seems to be that moment alone that perhaps got some, if not all, of this scene removed, as Kubo himself has commented on the scene's removal, saying it was apparently considered too lewd to be left in. Interestingly, a shot of Yoruichi from this cut sequence was included in one of the original teasers for the 1,000-Year Blood War arc anime. But this is interesting. The anime has so far used its later time slot to showcase incredible violence, the likes of which you would never have seen in the original series, but apparently anything overtly sexual has been mostly left on the cutting room floor. I remember an old interview from, I think, just before Core 2 began, where Kubo explained that he basically gave the team free rein to remove any and all comedic scenes they wanted to, but it's interesting that there does seem to be an element of censorship here too, based off of Kubo's remarks anyway. So all of that was removed from this week's episode, replaced with an admittedly deflated introduction for Yoruichi, which we'll now get into. Firstly, there's the Akon scene, which now makes no sense in the anime whatsoever. In the original chapter, he tells Kisuke she's arrived, meaning she's on her way and she'll be in that room soon, and there's a bit of time before Yoruichi shows up. In the anime, Akon tells Kisuke she's arrived, to which Kisuke tells him to let her know to prepare for the next stage. Yet immediately after, as soon as Akon closes the door, Yoruichi simply drops from the ceiling of the lab and half-heartedly waves to everyone before turning to Kisuke. First of all, we know what the inside of the lab looks like, so was Yoruichi just hanging from the ceiling this whole time, waiting for her introduction? Secondly, while I have no problem with them removing her original introduction, she could have at least said hello to everyone, since she hasn't seen them presumably since the Arrancar arc. But I digress. I saw some comments on my live reaction saying they thought maybe Kisuke and Akon were talking about someone else, perhaps Riruka. But that doesn't really make sense at all. There's no indication that Riruka ever comes to the Seirete. The last we saw of her, she was arriving in Waco Mundo alongside Yukio, and as far as I can tell, she stays there, since the next time we see them, she's inside the Garganta with Grimjo and Neliel. What reason would Riruka have to arrive, and why talk about one female guest arriving and then have Yoruichi show up and have that female guest not be Yoruichi? Riruka doesn't actually show up in the story for about another 50 odd chapters at this point. But the anime's version is undoubtedly strange, because Akon clearly doesn't talk to Yoruichi after leaving the room, so what's going on here? I personally think it's a case of crossed wires. Maybe there was a small cut scene that helped make this flow a little better. Because as it stands, Yoruichi was apparently in that room the entire time, which is really weird. That being said, she looks really nice in the Thousand Year Blood War colouring style. Yoruichi reveals several small jars inside her cloak which contain energy left over from the tears in the fabric of reality created when the Vandenreich tried to destabilise the worlds at the start of the arc. Initially, a lot of this subplot featuring the remaining Vizards in the human world was cut from the anime completely. But as of Core 2, it's been resurrected, and here we get a new scene that delves into it a little bit deeper. In the new scene, Hiyori is shown giving a briefing to the other Vizard, Hachi, Love, and Lisa, about the distortions that have been popping up. It's a nice moment, and I appreciate seeing it and the other Vizards, even if it's a bit of a shame that early, pre-invasion threat of the Vandenreich was eliminated in the first core. With the explanation out of the way, Kisuke reveals that using the energy collected from those distortions thanks to the efforts of Yoruichi and the Vizards, they can finally prepare to fire the cannon and head for the royal palace. Ichigo, Chad, and Orihime, with determined expressions on their faces, are ready to go. At this point, the episode returns us to the battle between Ikkaku, Yumichika, Giselle, and Bambietta. While there's still about half of the episode to go at this point, the rest is, as mentioned earlier, quite faithful to the source material. We are past all of the biggest changes now. Ikkaku and Yumichika continue to run from Bambietta's blasts as Yumichika once again figures out exactly what's going on with the Quincy Shrift, explained to Ikkaku that he won't be able to deflect Bambietta's bombs. Thinking about it, it's surprising that Yumichika was able to correctly deduce exactly what the explode does, when even Komamura couldn't totally work it out, and he let a blast detonate on his arm after his animal intuition told him that something was wrong. But anyway, knowing this, Ikkaku decides to rush the Sternritter instead. As Ikkaku flies towards Bambietta, Yumichika activates Hado 57 Daichi Tenyo, flinging some debris towards her to give Ikkaku some covering fire. And we see Bambietta's blasts collide with the rocks in a shower of blue flame. As a pretty random aside, speaking of blue flame, I wish a specific Sternritter had turned out to be responsible for the blue flame used in Waco Mundo. Or at the very least, I would have liked to have seen the Quincy's using it a bit more, for example to set some of the Seirete alight. Anyway, Ikkaku lunges for Bambietta, stabbing her through the throat before she grabs his head and tries to blow it to pieces. In a flash, Yumichika is right beside them, and he slices off Bambietta's arm in one swipe, sending both the arm and the bomb flying downwards. Just as it was in the original chapter, this is a lovely bit of choreography that translated really well to the anime. Plus, it's great to see just how on the ball Yumichika is, appearing at Ikkaku's side the moment he was in trouble. As Giselle reveals that Bambietta is long dead, Bambietta unleashes a point-blank explosion, blasting Ikkaku and Yumichika and sending them spiraling down to the ground below. This is an interesting example of the explode being used, as it doesn't seem like Bambietta is turning anything into a bomb here. The Reishi blast itself simply detonates near her hand, so maybe she's using the air itself. The way Giselle sprightly hops and skips around the battlefield is a great bit of additional character for her, making her appear both devious but also kind of whimsical, like a weird little goblin of death or something. As Giselle reveals that she was the one who finished off Bambietta before turning her into a zombie, she prepares to zombify Ikkaku and Yumichika before suddenly an immense flash of heavenly light signals the arrival of Mayuri himself onto the battlefield behind them, ending chapter 589. Before we move on, this only occurred to me during preparation for this video, but if it's really as simple as that to zombify a Shinigami, a drop of her blood being splashed on them, then why didn't Giselle just cut her finger and splash some blood on Kenpachi when he was immobile? When all of the Bambis were arguing over who should get the final kill, surely turning Kenpachi into one of their slaves would have easily been the best option on the table there. Imagine how terrifying that would have actually been to witness. A totally unencumbered, unfettered Kenpachi, like zombie Hitsugaya but perhaps a lot worse. Certainly more destructive. Once again though, I have to compliment how the anime is portraying Mayuri's sunsuit. The shimmering, shining effect looks really fantastic, though it's difficult to translate into a thumbnail, as I found out this week. But it's cool how it completely gilds the entire surrounding area, bathing it in a warming gold light. As the episode title, Marching Out the Zombies, finally appears, I'm glad they kept it chapter accurate because it looks really great with the creepy deep purple lettering. We get some really nice and dynamic shots of Mayuri looming over everyone, casting a blinding light across the screen. This is probably one of my favourite shots of the episode, an evolution of an earlier shot taken from the source material, but this time angled to include Ikkaku and Yumichika too for extra depth. It's really great. Before the fight can begin, however, the zombified Bambietta begs Giselle for her blood. As discussed in my battle analysis, the scene is depicted in such a way as to be suggestive, but we later learn the truth about what Giselle's zombies actually need. A very literal link to their puppet master in the form of her blood coursing through their veins. I really love the wide shot of Giselle and Bambietta underneath the vast blood-red sky, tinted slightly orange thanks to Mayuri's suit. It has a really sinister quality to it that works excellently for the scene. Bambietta's voice actress does wonderful work here too, completely transforming the character from the brash and fiery individual we once knew to this utterly submissive and terrified shell of her former self. This is definitely one of the most brutal scenes in the arc, but it's designed to reflect the abusive nature of Giselle's controlling mentality. She holds the same kind of power over Bambietta that Mayuri does over Nemu, though Mayuri seems to have mellowed out somewhat since his Soul Society arc days. One of the biggest themes of the fight is the idea of control, as seen in the zombies being used on both sides, and this scene captures a very ugly side of it that is portrayed really well here. There's even a new detail where Bambietta tries to hold Giselle's arm, only for Giselle to maliciously push her away. It's definitely tough because, as I mentioned in my recent Bambi's video, the girls all seem to be friends in some kind of a weird sense, as friendly as bloodthirsty Sternritter can be in the Vandenrijk's dog-eat-dog world anyway. But Giselle is undeniably a monster who has clearly just been waiting for one of them to become vulnerable, as we see when she thinks for a moment she can zombify Candice too. The anime's improved art this week is also on show here, especially when you get the close-up of Giselle's twisted expression. As Giselle goes on the offensive against Mayuri, we see that Bambietta is seemingly able to hold a number of her reishi blasts in front of her before loosing them at her enemy while in Volstendish. The remainder of this portion of the battle plays out very similarly to the source material. Bambietta and Giselle give chase into the sky, with Bambietta firing a volley of blasts at Mayuri and Nemu once again. However, Mayuri releases several orbs into the air which seem to absorb Bambietta's reishi. As Bambietta and Giselle find themselves in the midst of the orbs, they suddenly detonate, releasing the explosive power in a ball of ruby red fire. I remember finding this sequence a little artistically bland in the original chapter, and I think it benefits a lot from the colour and impact the anime can bring. As Mayuri details how he's managed to successfully negate Bambietta's ability with ease, he proposes the two of them become his research subjects before Giselle summons an entire horde of Shinigami zombies to her side. Unfortunately, the CGI zombies, much like the CGI officers from a couple of weeks back, don't look particularly good here. It doesn't help that there's only about 3 character models spread out across almost 20 men. It's slightly jarring too that when the angle changes to be a little closer to them, the zombies are hand-drawn once more and look immediately superior. However, upon seeing the zombified Shinigami, Mayuri realises he has an opportunity to try something new, and as we reach the end of chapter 590, Mayuri calls in 4 previously deceased Arrancar to assist him in battle. The 4 Arrancar, Dordoni, Soruchi, Lupi and Charlotte all arrive in a suitably dramatic fashion. As I mentioned in my live reaction, it does feel like a big missed opportunity that the anime didn't play any of the iconic tracks associated with the Arrancar from the original series. Something like La Distancia para un Duelo or Nube Negra, for example. Some of these songs associated with the Arrancar are so famous that this style of soundtrack is synonymous with the Bleach anime. In fact, the more I think about it, the more I'm surprised they didn't do it. This is really the only chance they're going to get to include a taste of that very famous Arrancar flair, and it would have been wonderfully nostalgic. I suppose it could be used later on, but I think this is probably when it would have fit best. On the flip side, you can really feel when an episode is allowed to be paced a little better. This fight is pretty much identical to the source material, right down to Ikkaku and Yumichika both remembering Lupi and Charlotte respectively, and it's great. A small comedic scene is cut later on once Mayuri blasts the Arrancar. In the cutscene, the three of them scream as they're being zapped, with Dordoni and Soruchi crying out about how Mayuri simply can't be trusted. Mayuri continues to zap them, amazed that they can still talk, before explaining that their bodies are physically fine. The agony they're feeling comes from an electrical signal that stimulates pain directly in the brain itself. This is all gone from the episode. The next time we see Giselle, she's once again surrounded by CGI zombies for some reason, despite the camera angle being fairly close to them this time. And despite Ikkaku and Yumichika's protests, Mayuri sends the Arrancar into battle against the zombie Shinigami. As Mayuri finishes espousing the words of Yamamoto to Ikkaku and Yumichika, the battle rages on, with Dordoni ducking out of the way of a splash of blood from his zombie opponent for fear of being transformed himself should he get hit by it. However, as Lupi and Soruchi assure him he won't become a zombie, Dordoni leaps into battle undeterred. This is all exactly as it is in the source material. There's really not a lot to say. Meanwhile, Giselle reattaches Bambietta's severed arm before being confronted by Charlotte. As with the original chapter, Bambietta jumps into battle against Charlotte, firing rounds of bombs at him, but he dodges each of them with ease before grabbing the Sternritter by the face and launching her into a building. The anime is even able to include the little comedic sequence where Mayuri remarks that it's a shame Charlotte couldn't manage to hit him with Bambietta, to which Charlotte says that his hand merely slipped. As Bambietta re-emerges from the dust and blasts towards the Arrancar, Charlotte fires his pink Cero at her. Unlike in the source material, here, Charlotte actually recites the entire name of his ability once again, which was again a little nostalgic, but he reveals a slightly updated name from before. This time it's beautiful Charlotte Culhorn's final holy, wonderful, pretty, super magnum, sexy, glamorous Cero revived. It's a shame Cero is so rarely seen in this arc, as they look absolutely stunningly good in the new style. I think this might be the only Cero, maybe, that we see in the source material of the 1,000-Year Blood War, but in the anime, Apache sneezed one out in the battle against Kyuge Opi's Yagged Arme forces in Core 1-2. Interestingly, the Cero has a slightly different result here in the anime to the source material. In the original chapter, the Cero seems to just wash over Bambietta and totally obliterate her as though she's being incinerated within the blast, which is typically how Cero has worked in the past. Here, though, the Cero collides with her and seemingly sends her flying into the sky instead. I love the attention to detail here, though. The way Charlotte's Cero whirs into life with several Reiatsu hearts that come together to form the blast is excellent. But as Giselle watches Bambietta go soaring into the air, she decides to call her ultimate trump card into play. As chapter 591 comes to an end, and the episode as well, everyone on the battlefield looks on in shock and horror as a new zombie arrives. Toshiro Hitsugaya steps onto the battlefield, freezing the ground beneath him, a dead-eyed stare glossing over his newly dull red eyes. As I mentioned at the start, this episode includes the first couple of pages from chapter 592, but it's literally just the reactions from the different Arrancar, Ikkaku and Yumichika to Hitsugaya's arrival. Hitsugaya's sinister return makes for an excellent cliffhanger this week, and does make a little part of me long for the days where fights lasted more than one episode, as there's so much potential for tension and suspense build up in them, as this one demonstrates really nicely. The poem this week features Mayuri and reads over and over again, "An empty life." The poem seems to simply be referencing the effects of Mayuri's new drug that he's about to test on an unwitting Hitsugaya, forcing him to relive the same moments again and again. The empty life, of course, referring to the current sad state of Hitsugaya's existence. But that's it for the episode itself, so as we go to wrap this video up, once again, no Sternritter were killed this week. It's a miracle, but I have a feeling that might be about to change real soon. For now though, there's no need for the Wall of Memoriam once again, so on to the predictions. I've been alluding to this throughout the entire video, but I think next week could be a lot of fun. I know I'm being optimistic, probably naively so, but there's a lot I'd like to see, so let's take a look. It's possible that next week will cover a similar number of chapters to this episode in order to have a cliffhanger that ends at the very start of the Royal Palace battle. I could see episode 23, for example, spanning chapters 592 to 597, hopefully with some extra content thrown in. If the anime is really moving all of the Royal Palace scenes to fit together, then we won't return to the palace itself until the second half of chapter 597, but the anime may simply open that up as the cliffhanger of the episode. Let's start at the beginning, as I do have a lot to talk about here. All that's really left of the Mayuri vs Giselle fight are chapters 592 and 593, which, honestly, the episode could blow through like that. Most of that is just Hitsugaya carving people up before then being subdued by Mayuri. I honestly wouldn't be too shocked to see these chapters wrapped up in the first full 5 minutes of the episode or something before we then move on to our next fight, Byakuya versus Pepe, and the final real battle that takes place down in the Seirete. I'm actually, I'll admit, really curious to see this, but before we get to that, I'm seriously hoping we at least see a little bit of Byakuya versus Candice, Nanana, Robert, Lil Toto, and Meninas beforehand. Of course, this is another opportunity to get Robert's mysterious shrift, perhaps the best opportunity he's going to get. But well, after BG9, I'm not holding my breath anymore. Pepe's fight, on the other hand, is fairly short, but as unpopular as he is, I'm not expecting much of it to be removed at all. I'm actually morbidly excited to see how they bring him to life on screen, and I wouldn't even mind a small extension to this battle. I always thought Pepe was going to be a much more threatening character than he turned out to be, but even then he successfully backed Byakuya into a corner before being unceremoniously and rapidly turned into a joke. So I wouldn't mind seeing a little more of that fight before we move on. But the cliffhanger of the episode could be a few different things. Either the episode will end with chapter 597, in which case it might end with Pepe being devoured by Lil Toto, or go so far as to tease the battle in the Royal Palace by including the first half of chapter 588 that we missed from this week's episode, ending the episode, episode 23, with Yuha-Buck's invasion of the palace after Pepe's death. That honestly makes a ton of sense to me. It seems like by shuffling scenes around, the anime team has managed to save, hopefully, 3 full episodes for the battle in the Royal Palace. They've also achieved this by stuffing the entire Gremmy fight into one episode, as well as covering as much ground as they did in episode 21 2 weeks back. So, with potentially 3 whole episodes to play with, 24, 25 and 26, I'm feeling pretty good about the Royal Palace showdown. If we do end next week's episode with Yuha-Buck's arrival in Ryokyu, then episode 24 will likely include the first half of 588 combined with the second half of 597, featuring Tenjiro's showdown with Yhwach, which again hopefully gets expanded, and could last up to anywhere between chapter 602 to 604, reasonably. That would leave 2 whole episodes for Ichigo versus Yhwach, and it doesn't seem likely to me that they'd need that much time. So I'm really holding out hope for a decently extended battle between the Zero Division and the Schutzstaffel, a battle that actually gives these all-powerful Shinigami a chance to show us what they can really do, a chance to show us how they fight with their all to defend their quarry. The battle, the actual showdown between the real Zero Division and the Schutzstaffel only lasts between chapters 600 to 604, and even then it is split up between the time in the Royal Palace and what's going on down below. As I've said before, I don't expect the world from this. I'm not expecting them all to use bankai, for example, but it would be great to see some shikai for these characters and actually learn what they do. In the source material, we get to see Tenjiro's shikai Kinpika, but we never find out what it does. We also see, presumably, the sealed forms of Hikifune and Senjumaru's Zanpakuto, a giant spoon and needle respectively, but we don't learn a thing about either of them. Now is the time for all of that to change. This is all assuming, of course, that the core will end where I originally predicted, chapter 611 and the death of the Soul King. There's not too long to wait until we find out how this all plays out, and I'm very excited. So, all in all, I was pleasantly surprised by episode 22 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc marching out the zombies. It could have been easy to pass off this episode and the fight it contains as just killing time before the main event takes centre stage, but the anime team really put the work in this week, and it shows. The art was an order of magnitude better than the previous episode, and the battle between Mayuri and Giselle has so far been adapted very faithfully thanks to improved pacing as a result of a smaller chapter count. That said, there were a lot of cuts this week, some that I'm fine with, others that I feel could have been in the episode. But for the most part, this was another really solid outing. I've seen a bit of negativity towards Core 2 cropping up in general, but as someone who read the 1000-Year Blood War arc on a week-by-week basis back in the day, and relatively recently made a video about how good, but how messy the second Quincy invasion is, I think the anime has so far done a pretty good job at keeping it all neatly closed together, while even removing some of the loose ends and helping to bridge gaps in other places. Remember that the 1000-Year Blood War was, and is, a very ambitious arc for Bleach. There's an awful lot going on here at pretty much all times. Regardless, I am so excited to see the last 4 episodes. I've got high hopes for sure. I just hope they're not too high. But that's it for the video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. What did you think of episode 22? What did you think of the cuts this week? Do you think they worked well for the episode? Or do you think they took away from it? What do you think of the changes as well? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below, so please do let me know. What do you want to see from next week's episode in regards to new content? Is there any chance we'll get Robert Schrift? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.